Frank Lavin is the CEO of Export Now. He's live in Canton, Ohio. David Adelman is Managing Director at KraneShares. He's live in New York. Both served as US ambassadors to Singapore, Frank under President Bush and David under President Obama. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. And Frank, first to you. In President Biden's State of the Union address, clearly no shortage of major issues to be contending with here, including the crisis unfolding in Ukraine. What's your take on this speech? Was this a win for the president or perhaps a missed opportunity here?
Well, I thought he did a good job of articulating his vision. So it was a win in that sense. I thought he had a real high mark then when it was the Ukraine discussion. It was forceful. He was in command. He enjoyed or won bipartisan support. So that was the high point. Most of the rest of the speech, he was really playing to his constituency. I don't think there's anything new. I thought the economic part was a little weak, but I think he hit all of his marks. He did what he had to do, and he articulated his vision, and he showed he was on top of his game.
David, over to you. Of course, Ukraine being front and center in this speech. Just how critical is getting Ukraine right for President Biden's prospects in the midterms, and what did you make of this address?
Well, getting Ukraine right is important for the world, not just for President Biden's prospects. I agree with Ambassador Lavin, my friend. I think President Biden hit his marks. Look, traditionally, the president's State of the Union address is his opportunity to speak directly to the American people. And I think in the case of this year, he's speaking not just to the American people, but hundreds of millions of people in Europe. And one person in the Kremlin in particular with regard to the situation in Ukraine. The presidency is often described as the hardest job in the world. And I think we can see that on full display this year. President Biden has to deal with Russia's aggression in Europe, the ongoing challenges of the pandemic, and of course, global economic pressures. He spoke for about an hour to the American people, devoted the first part of the speech to Ukraine, with frankly a lot of sort of lofty rhetoric, democracy, not autocracy, freedom, not tyranny, the announcement of some increasing incremental sanctions, the sort of enforcement of sanctions on any prohibition on any Russian aircraft coming into American airspace. And the rest of the speech, I think, was what you would expect as a sort of traditional American Democratic presidential speech, made in America, jobs, prescription drugs. I thought he was particularly strong in speaking about the pandemic. I think he was very forceful, very empathetic. 3 out of every 4 Americans are now vaccinated and boosted. America is beginning to open up. School children are no longer being asked to wear masks in classrooms. So I think he was very strong in talking about how far America has come with regard to defeating COVID and defeating the coronavirus.
Absolutely, David. And you really get the sense that this speech probably would have looked a lot different as it was being written over the past few weeks. But of course, as Ukraine continued to unfold, it has, as a result, taken center stage. Frank, over to you on a comment you made earlier regarding the economic messaging here. President Biden absolutely acknowledging the rising prices that we see as a result of inflation at a 4-decade high. Of course, the energy crisis also playing out here as we see Brent crude now above $110 a barrel. But why do you say his messaging on the economy was weak? Are you seeing gaps here, particularly on the inflation narrative, which he says he can fix, but ultimately that's the role of the US Federal Reserve, right?
Yeah, look, I thought it was just a bit muddled, Dan. I'll give you a few examples. He said, let's lower prices by reshoring U.S. production. Well, look, I'm all for reshoring. I think it'd be great it happens. But the reason this economic activity takes place offshore is because they've already determined that it's lower prices offshore. So you can't simply assert or plea or make an argument that you're going to lower prices if you come back, or else they'd already come back. So that was just an odd argumentation, I thought. On energy, he didn't talk about increasing supply. He said we're going to take energy from the strategic reserve and deploy that, which is a good idea. as a one-off, but that doesn't fundamentally change the supply-demand dynamic. So what can be done to get U.S. production up? Could he say something about nuclear power? Could he say something about putting more drilling land at ease? But he's not. He has ambivalent feelings, I sense, about getting U.S. energy production up. So he didn't go down that path. So I thought it was not a very forceful message. But let me say this. I think if we're all sitting down, say 6 months from now, I think David alluded to this point, and I agree with it. I think 90% or 95% of how he's going to be evaluated 6 months from now will be, did Ukraine to come to some kind of successful conclusion? Is economic growth on track? And are the numbers for COVID at least improving? We know it won't be solved in 6 months, but is at least moving the right way. And I think he's in pretty good shape on all three of those, although look, the history's still being written as we speak. But I think he's poised for a decent next 6 months, all right? And we'll just have to see how it unfolds.
David, I can see you shaking your head, perhaps in acknowledgement or in denial. Did you want to respond to that?
No, it's absolutely acknowledgement. I agree with what Frank has said. The American economy, the global economy, is under a lot of pressure, and President Biden, sort of is unable to offer, a great specific plan for addressing some of the pressures on American consumers and American families. With regard to energy, I think the uncertainty in Europe and the uncertainty with regard to sort of the massive resource-producing Russian economy, creates a problem that, no American president has a simple answer for. I think President Biden on energy would love to get back to a place where he's talking about alternatives to fossil fuels and maybe, ultimately one takeaway that comes from, what is likely to be long-standing sanctions against Russia's energy production will be, more energy independence in the West, and maybe even, as Frank has mentioned, revival of nuclear powered electric power plants and other alternatives to oil and natural gas and coal.
And David, on another point here, President Biden also spoke today about reducing America's reliance on foreign supply chains. It seems like the Made in America mantra is back. What's your reaction to that? And as a former ambassador, what do you think it actually means for Asia, for example?
Well, look, Made in America has always been a winning line in presidential campaigns and in State of the Union speeches. The reality is we're in a globalized economy. And as much as the United States would like to return its manufacturing capacity to, what used to be called the Rust Belt in the United States, the dynamic of the global economy, and as a result, global supply chains is here to stay. Ultimately, President Trump tried to prosecute a trade war over 4 years, and what we saw coming out of that is global supply chains remained intact, and arguably were ultimately bolstered by increased diversification in response to President Trump's trade war that he was prosecuting against China. So, look, the rhetoric of American presidents at the State of the Union podium, oftentimes on trade, doesn't ultimately play out in the reality of the globalized economy. One thing I think that will be interesting is, what's happened in Eastern Europe, what's happened in Ukraine, seems to have sort of strengthened and sort of redoubled the unity amongst the Western European countries, and maybe that ultimately will inure to the benefit of global supply chains in Europe. With regard to Asia, it's interesting. I suppose leaders in Beijing were happy listening to President Biden's speech, because this is the first time in the last few years, at least, that China hasn't been sort of at the top of the list in having the Made in America conversation. It seems as though, at least for now, America's pivot to Asia may be knocked off the front page of the newspapers as the world looks at the sort of daily developments in Ukraine and in Europe. Supply chains in Asia are likely to not just remain in place, but may ultimately benefit from what most people are seeing as a likely recession in Europe. And despite all of the rhetoric, I think American businesses and leaders, recognize that they are operating in a globalized economy and will continue to make the investments in Asia and elsewhere around the world to support their supply chains.
Absolutely, and that is what makes it so fascinating. Frank, your response to that as well. And with regards to this Made in America mantra, how can President Biden actually execute on this when this administration and administrations past, let's say, maybe not the Trump administration included, but perhaps the Obama administration, was so late to countering the rise of China?
Let me respond to that and then key off of something David said, because, look, I agree with David's point that I think I had to view that it's unobjectionable, it's even laudable, but it's fundamentally an applause line if it's not bolstered by a serious policy initiative. And I just didn't see that in this speech. And remember the context. President Biden has a very thin legislative majority, and it's soft and it's elusive. So he is going to have a great deal of trouble trying to turn that rhetoric into programs of action. So I think we have to say it's more of a hope than a plan of that. But I want to agree with my friend David on his comments on China, because I think successful handling of the Ukraine crisis, which I give the president high marks on to date, will be very helpful in establishing a better conversation with Beijing for the U.S. and for Europe. That I think Europe had largely been dismissed by Beijing as a commercial collection, not interested in a specific policy agenda, and not worth engaging on these policy matters. I think this Ukraine intervention changes that dramatically, that the West is still a very important construct in international policy, that the West can move on financial and on political military issues very quickly. There's a high degree of unity in the NATO and the other European partners, and it's a useful way to start a conversation with Beijing with that in the backdrop.
And before I let you both go, I thought we could end with a look ahead to the future. The polls say that President Biden's first year in office has been a failure, and even top Democrats like Mike Bloomberg, for example, say the president is on track for an electoral wipeout in November. So, Frank, what needs to be done now to perhaps counter this? What can the president do to firm up his prospects in the midterms? You first.
I think the single most important goal he can attain this year is keeping economic growth on track, and I would advise him to be probably less ambitious in his strategy. If he just did 2 or 3 little microeconomic steps ahead to allow business to grow a little faster or hire a little more, he would keep growth on track. And that's within reach. It'd be something bipartisan. He could do that, and he might rebound from what looks like a bleak November for him.
David, your response?
Look, presidents historically suffer defeats in midterm elections. So predictions that Democrats will suffer defeats this year are, very easy to make. Look, ultimately elections are won and lost on domestic issues and how the American people are feeling about the direction of the country. A lot of it this year, I think, will be determined by how American families think about the virus and the way America's economy is sort of reopening and reemerging at the tail end, or what may very well be the tail end of the impact of the pandemic. So, we're having this conversation the first week of March. The November elections are many political lifetimes from now. The midterm elections may ultimately be decided based on an issue that we cannot even anticipate here months before. But historically, it's the kitchen table issues. It's how American families feel about the direction of the country that will determine whether there's sort of massive swings or not in the midterm elections.
Indeed, and a lot can happen between now and then. Gentlemen, we'll leave it there. Ambassador Lavin, Ambassador Adelman, thank you for joining me today. That's Frank Lavin and David Adelman, former US ambassadors to Singapore, with a wrap on President Biden's first State of the Union address.